The sunlight sparkled on the still lake as Michael eased his boat toward the dock, the soft hum of the motor blending with the gentle rustle of the trees. This lake had always been his sanctuary, a place his grandfather had purchased long before the neighborhood and the HOA even existed. He tied the ropes with practiced hands, already imagining the quiet afternoon he'd planned, just fishing, reading, and letting the world slow down. But peace never lasted long when Karen was around. He heard the sharp click of heels against the wooden planks and turned to see her marching toward him, her expression locked in disapproval. She wore a crisp white blouse and oversized sunglasses, clutching a clipboard like a badge of authority. Without even saying hello, she pointed toward his boat. "You can't keep this here," she snapped, her voice echoing across the water. "This dock is for HOA members." Michael straightened, a calm smile forming on his face. "I am an HOA member," he replied evenly, though he didn't need to be to use his own dock. She scoffed, mistaking his calm for weakness. Karen began lecturing him about regulations, access rules, and something about property standards. A small group of curious neighbors gathered at the end of the path, whispering to each other. Michael listened quietly, letting her go on, not because he couldn't shut her down, but because he wanted to see how far she'd go. She gestured toward the lake, as if it belonged to her committee. He could almost laugh. This woman had no idea the entire lake was legally his. She wasn't talking to a trespasser. She was standing on his property, barking orders like a self-appointed queen. Michael kept his hands in his pockets, already knowing this was only the beginning. That evening, Karen wasted no time calling an emergency HOA board meeting. The clubhouse lights were still flickering on when she swept in, clipboard clutched tightly to her chest like a sword. She was determined to make Michael the villain of the night. A handful of board members sat around the long wooden table, some with coffee, some already looking tired. She dramatically placed a printed set of lake usage rules in the center, rules she had written herself just hours earlier. "This kind of behavior sets a bad example," she announced, pacing the room as if she were delivering a grand speech. "We can't allow people to take over common spaces like that." Most members exchanged uncertain glances. The lake had always been there, quiet and peaceful, but no one had ever questioned who actually owned it. Karen, however, was full of confidence. She declared that only HOA-approved boats should be allowed to dock. Her voice grew sharper as she spoke, trying to stir outrage. A few nodded along, but not out of conviction, more out of habit. Then one older gentleman, Mr. Harris, cleared his throat. "Karen, the lake isn't HOA property," he said carefully. "It belongs to Michael's family. Everyone knows that." Karen laughed, a quick, dismissive sound. "No, Mr. Harris, everything in this community falls under HOA authority," she insisted, waving off his words. Her arrogance filled the room like thick smoke. She motioned for a vote on her new rule, acting as if ownership didn't matter. Meanwhile, in his house by the lake, Michael sat at his kitchen table with a letter in hand, the official warning Karen had sent. Instead of frustration, amusement spread across his face. He opened a drawer and laid the letter beside the original property deed, a powerful reminder that her paper rules meant nothing compared to the real thing. The next morning, Michael woke early to the sound of loud tapping outside. When he stepped onto his porch with a cup of coffee in hand, the sight before him was almost comical. A group of HOA volunteers, wearing bright vests and looking very official, were hammering laminated warning signs into the ground near his dock. Bold red letters read, "Unauthorized use subject to fine." Karen stood nearby with her clipboard, hands on her hips, directing the placement of each sign like a general preparing for battle. She didn't even glance at him at first, too caught up in her self-importance. Michael leaned on the porch railing, sipping his coffee, and watched them with quiet amusement. When she finally noticed him, her chin lifted as she announced loudly, "This is your last warning. Move the boat or face penalties." She spoke as if she had the power to enforce something. Michael calmly walked down to the dock and looked her in the eye. "Who gave you permission to post these signs here?" he asked. Karen gave a short, confident laugh. "The HOA doesn't need your permission. This is shared property," she declared. Michael tilted his head slightly, a faint smile playing on his lips. "You sure about that?" he asked softly. She smirked back, clearly thinking she had the upper hand. Without another word, Michael pulled out his phone, scrolled to his contacts, and pressed a number. "Good morning." His lawyer's voice came through on speaker. Karen's smug expression faltered as the attorney firmly explained that the lake and dock were privately owned, and the HOA had no jurisdiction over them. The other volunteers shifted nervously, realizing they might be on the wrong side. Karen, however, stubborn as ever, snapped, "We'll see about that," before storming off. Michael just chuckled, knowing the real fight hadn't even started yet. A few days later, Karen decided to escalate her little power play. Flyers appeared on everyone's doors announcing a community cleanup and fishing event at the lake. She had planned everything without asking Michael. Not a word, not a courtesy call, nothing. On Saturday morning, Michael walked down toward the dock expecting quiet water. Instead, he found folding chairs, coolers, tackle boxes, and half a dozen HOA members setting up tents like it was a public park. The fishing club was gathered in full force, and at the center of it all was Karen, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and giving orders with the confidence of someone who thought she ruled the world. Michael stopped at the edge of the dock, hands in his pockets, observing the scene. Karen turned and smirked when she saw him. "Good morning," she said in a falsely sweet voice. "We're holding an HOA event. Either join in or stay out of the way." A few members gave him uncertain looks, clearly realizing something about this didn't feel right. "This is my dock," Michael said calmly. "And this is private property." Karen rolled her eyes as if he were being dramatic. "Michael, the lake is part of the community. It's for everyone," she said loudly, making sure her little audience heard every word. Michael didn't argue. Instead, he pulled out his phone and began recording. His steady voice documented the exact time, date, and the fact that a group of HOA members was trespassing on private land. A couple of them shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that this wasn't just a neighborly disagreement. Karen crossed her arms, still wearing that smug expression. She didn't know it yet, but every second of that morning would soon become solid evidence against her bold but foolish stunt. The following Monday morning, Michael sat across from his attorney in a quiet corner office downtown. The sunlight streamed through the blinds as he slid a neat stack of documents across the desk. The warning letters, the flyers, and photos from the fishing club event. His attorney, Ms. Carter, raised a brow as she flipped through the pile. "They really thought they could take over your lake?" she asked, half amused, half incredulous. Michael leaned back in his chair, completely calm. "They're convinced the HOA rules apply to everything they can see," he replied with a shrug. Ms. Carter began drafting a formal cease and desist letter. Her pen moved quickly, each line sharper than the last. She explained that this letter would make it clear. The lake and dock were privately owned, and any continued trespassing would result in legal action. Michael agreed without hesitation. But he wanted more than just a warning. He wanted to make sure they couldn't pull a stunt like this again. She smiled knowingly and began preparing an eviction notice for the fishing club, revoking any assumed right they thought they had to use his property. "Once this hits their inbox," she said, "they'll have no room to pretend they didn't know." That evening, Michael returned home and posted a new sign at the lake entrance. "Private property, trespassers will be prosecuted." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise backed by law. Early the next morning, a few HOA members saw the sign and whispered nervously. Karen, however, stood there with her arms crossed and dismissed it as scare tactics. What she didn't realize was that the legal wheels were already in motion. Michael wasn't bluffing. He was preparing for a clean, decisive strike. The following Monday morning, Michael sat across from his attorney in a quiet corner office downtown. The sunlight streamed through the blinds as he slid a neat stack of documents across the desk. The warning letters, the flyers, and photos from the fishing club event. His attorney, Ms. Carter, raised a brow as she flipped through the pile. "They really thought they could take over your lake?" she asked, half amused, half incredulous. Michael leaned back in his chair, completely calm. "They're convinced the HOA rules apply to everything they can see," he replied with a shrug. Ms. Carter began drafting a formal cease and desist letter. Her pen moved quickly, each line sharper than the last. She explained that this letter would make it clear. The lake and dock were privately owned, and any continued trespassing would result in legal action. Michael agreed without hesitation. But he wanted more than just a warning. He wanted to make sure they couldn't pull a stunt like this again. She smiled knowingly and began preparing an eviction notice for the fishing club, revoking any assumed right they thought they had to use his property. Once this hits their inbox, she said, they'll have no room to pretend they didn't know. That evening, Michael returned home and posted a new sign at the lake entrance. Private property, trespassers will be prosecuted. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise backed by law. Early the next morning, a few HOA members saw the sign and whispered nervously. Karen, however, stood there with her arms crossed and dismissed it as scare tactics. What she didn't realize was that the legal wheels were already in motion. Michael wasn't bluffing. He was preparing for a clean, decisive strike. The cease and desist letter arrived at the HOA office early Thursday morning, neatly stamped and legally binding. Karen ripped the envelope open in front of the board, her face tightening with each line she read. Her knuckles whitened as she slammed the papers down on the table. "This is outrageous," she snapped, her voice echoing through the small meeting room. The other board members glanced at one another, uneasy. None of them had signed up for legal trouble when they joined the HOA committee. Karen called an emergency meeting within the hour. She paced the length of the table like a general before battle. "We're not backing down," she declared. "If we let him win this, we lose control of the community." A few nodded, but it wasn't enthusiasm, it was fear. One board member quietly cleared his throat. "Karen, what if he's right? What if the lake isn't ours to regulate?" he asked cautiously. She glared at him, shutting him up instantly. "The HOA has authority over all shared spaces," she insisted, ignoring the fact that this wasn't one. Meanwhile, Michael wasn't pacing or shouting. He was at the county records office confirming every inch of the property line. When the clerk handed him the file, it was clear and irrefutable. The lake and shoreline belonged to his family alone. He made copies and sent them straight to his lawyer. By afternoon, the sheriff's office had been formally notified, and a trespass complaint was filed against the fishing club. Back at the HOA office, the board began to split. Some wanted to follow Karen, but others saw the legal writing on the wall. For the first time, doubt flickered in Karen's eyes. She could sense control slipping, but her pride wouldn't let her admit she'd gone too far. The morning sun cast a warm glow over the lake when two sheriff's deputies pulled up in their patrol SUV. Their presence was quiet but firm, and the sound of boots crunching on the gravel made the group at the dock turn their heads. Karen stood at the center of the fishing club event she had organized, passing out donuts and barking orders, still convinced she was untouchable. Michael leaned against the railing on his porch, arms crossed, watching everything unfold with calm anticipation. The deputies approached Karen first, holding a folded set of documents. "Ma'am," one said evenly, "we need everyone to clear out. This is private property, and the owner has filed a complaint for trespassing." Karen let out a sharp laugh, waving her clipboard like it carried the power of law. "You're mistaken," she said confidently. "This is HOA land. We have rules." The deputy didn't flinch. "No, ma'am. The lake and dock belong to Mr. Johnson. The property records are clear. If you don't leave, it'll be considered trespassing." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Several members began packing up their gear immediately, unwilling to test the deputy's patience. Karen's face flushed a deep red as she stammered for a response. "This is ridiculous." "He can't," she started, but the second deputy cut her off calmly. "He can. And he has." Michael stepped down from his porch but said nothing. He didn't need to. The sight of uniformed officers was enough to drive the point home. One by one, the fishing club members left, casting Karen uncomfortable glances. She stood frozen, her fake authority dissolving in front of everyone. When her eyes met Michael's, he gave a slight, polite nod, proof that he had won this round without lifting a finger. A week after the hearing, Michael decided it was time to finish what Karen had started. He contacted Ms. Carter, and together they drafted a formal eviction notice specifically directed at the HOA Fishing Club. The document was clear and final. No one was allowed to use the dock, shoreline, or lake without his permission. Signs were professionally installed along the property line. No more hand-painted warnings. These were bold, official, and backed by legal authority. He even had new security cameras mounted near the entrance, their small red lights blinking like quiet sentinels. The notice hit the HOA office like a cold wind. Karen read it with clenched teeth, but the rest of the board reacted differently this time. Several members, tired of her stubbornness, openly said they wanted no part in another legal mess. One by one, fishing club members began resigning. Some even knocked on Michael's door, offering quiet apologies for trespassing. "We just thought she had permission," one older man admitted. Michael accepted their words with calm grace. He wasn't after them. He was after the woman who had created the storm. Karen, however, wasn't ready to fade quietly. She tried to rally support at a neighborhood gathering, ranting about how Michael had taken the lake away from the community. But her voice didn't carry the same authority anymore. People whispered, but they didn't follow. She stood alone on that hill of stubborn pride, while Michael's position had never been stronger. The dock returned to its quiet rhythm. No more unwanted fishing chairs, no more shouting, no more trespassing. For the first time in weeks, Michael sat on the edge of the pier with a book in his hand, feeling the lake exactly as it was meant to be, peaceful in his. The HOA meeting that evening was packed. The room buzzed with attention Karen hadn't felt before. Where once people nodded along to her every word, now they avoided her gaze. The board sat stiffly at the front table. A motion already on the agenda. A vote to remove Karen as president. She walked in with her usual forced confidence, holding her clipboard like a shield. But this time, no one stood with her. Michael was invited to speak, though he hadn't planned on making a speech. He stood near the back, calm and collected. The board chair cleared his throat and read aloud the eviction notice, the cease and desist, and the county clerk's decision. "This matter has damaged the HOA's reputation," he said plainly. Karen tried to interrupt, claiming she was just protecting community rights. But no one cheered her on this time. One by one, the board members cast their votes. The tally was overwhelming. Karen was officially removed from her position as HOA president. A low murmur rippled through the crowd as she stood there frozen, cheeks flushed red, fingers tightening on her clipboard before she finally stormed out without a word. When it was Michael's turn to speak, he didn't gloat. His voice was steady and clear. "I've never been against the community," he said. "But the lake belongs to my family. Respect that and we'll have no problems." It was short, simple, and final. From that day forward, no one challenged his ownership again. The fishing club disbanded quietly. The dock remained his private haven, untouched and peaceful. As the sun set that evening, Michael sat at the water's edge with the soft ripple of the lake beneath him. The storm finally over. The HOA had learned its lesson, the hard way.